Axel, you're setting a bad example. Bad. Terry, you've been very patient. Thank you very much indeed. Terry comes to us today from the Countryside Commission. He originally worked in their regional office for the Southwest, also chairman of governors of a primary school, worked in recreation management in Cheshire and on Exmoor, and I think you're a Cornish man by birth, is that right? Yeah. Therefore, never far from the sea. And the Countryside Commission has an extremely difficult job in trying to sort out how England is used and to satisfy our expectations of what we want. Don't think we know half the time. I'm sure Terry has spent a great deal of time trying to find out what we do want of our countryside and how on earth to give it to us. Perhaps you may be talking about that, you may be talking about something quite different, but anyhow, we look forward to it.
Well, Elizabeth Watson earlier characterized the environmental debate in America as being peopled by a fair proportion of commentators striding around the arena with shopping bags full of doom and gloom to hand out that the end of the world is nigh. And it strikes me also on seeing the slides of the front pages of the Daily Mail that we do live in an age of hyperbole. We're encouraged to take extreme views on whatever issues there are of the day. The danger of running events like this in London is that you get a lot of us up from the country, perhaps a more friendly and less numerous group than come up to People Hyde Park, but I too are from Gloucestershire. I came up yesterday, so there's not as much straw behind my ears as there is behind Peter Nixon's. But there's a road that I take into Cheltenham every morning called Leckhampton Hill, runs down to Cheltenham. And for the third time this year, in common with I think most of the other roads in the southwest of England, it's been dug up from one end to the other. And I heard a story that in the last couple of weeks, because it is dug up at this very moment, I heard a story in the last couple of weeks that BBC Radio Gloucestershire had to put out an announcement which went something like this. We announced earlier this morning that there was chaos on Leckhampton Hill because it had been dug up. We've now received a telephone call from one of the residents of Leckhampton Hill, and we are able to tell you that some of the residents of Leckhampton Hill are suffering a degree of inconvenience by the fact that there's a small queue of cars on Leckhampton Hill. And this penchant for leaping for the most extreme word that we can use and to describe everything as doom and destruction is something which I think I want to hold at the centre of what I want to present to you this afternoon. Because I believe the subtext of the brief I've been given this afternoon, which you think is called Countryside for Us, but the letter I've got says Countryside for Us, brackets, are we loving it to death? I think that phrase has a degree of the hyperbole in it that I'm referring to. And you do hear people talking about destroying what we come to enjoy and loving the place to death. And I want to take apart some of the facts that we know about the use of the countryside and just examine whether that's a sensible view to take of the relationship that our population has with its countryside. Since the early 1970s, one of the predecessor bodies of the Countryside Agency, who I work for, the Countryside Commission, since the early 1970s, has been pretty profoundly involved in advising and assisting a large number of private individuals, private voluntary bodies and local authorities who have taken it upon themselves to manage the public interest in the countryside, most of which, of course, is privately owned. And so central to our whole understanding of our work is this maintaining the balance of the public interest in private land and the need to encourage the right sort of management regimes and the right sort of control regimes so that the land in the countryside, which is a shared resource for us all, even though it's privately owned, its benefits are to a large degree shared, to make sure that that sharing takes place in an equitable way, which safeguards the very thing that we all hold dear, the countryside itself. And so what I'm going to tell you is based on a fair degree of evidence, a fair degree of experience, then further backed up by evidence. So the first, I want to run through a whole set of figures to characterize the use of the countryside, the use that we make, the way the countryside comes to us as people who love it and want to be at large in it and enjoy it. So first of all, I'm going to deal with the size of the phenomenon of people visiting the countryside. And the first thing to note is that it's very big. 1/4 of all leisure trips, one quarter of all expeditions on leisure in the UK are trips to the countryside. And it's long been the case that connection with and affection for the countryside is a common and deep-rooted characteristic for the contemporary English psyche. A desire to go into the countryside, enjoy the relaxation to be found there, take fresh air and exercise, and appreciate its beauty are natural expressions of these affections. Access to the countryside is also particularly important for disadvantaged people, such as those with a disability or limited spending power. And one of the things which lies behind a publicly funded body like the Countryside Agency is the importance of equality of opportunity to people to enjoy, to get the benefits of the countryside that we all acknowledge. Leisure activities do have a significant environmental impact on the countryside, but it's both beneficial and adverse. And we must be careful not just to dwell on the adverse. For the vast majority of England, leisure activity forms a natural and harmonious component of the countryside scene. Recreational enjoyment of the countryside is of enormous value to the nation. It should be seen as one of the prime purposes of countryside policy. I would hold, why is there a publicly funded body called the Countryside Agency if it isn't because we all love the countryside and want to have a share in it? It's where all our policy comes home to roost, I think. It should be seen as one of the prime purposes of countryside policy, reflecting society's relationship with this aspect of its heritage, rather than as a secondary add-on to the countryside's purposes. Prime purposes may be as a producer of food, fibre, timber and minerals. Enjoyment of the countryside and the management of recreation are inextricably linked with the conservation of the beauty of the countryside itself. It therefore has to be a central theme in the Countryside Agency's work. We want a countryside for all to enjoy now and in the future, and aim to promote recreation in the countryside in ways which help sustain the present high quality of the countryside, but don't damage it. Now, Ted asked me to tell you what we know about what people want of the countryside. I haven't actually included that in my notes, but I can tell you it very quickly, because we do regularly survey this, and it's remarkably steadfast and immovable when you ask people, and we do ask people, and through a number of different research techniques, what is it about the countryside that you hold dear? And they keep coming back to getting away from stress, getting an arena in which they can be, they can take healthy exercise, they can feel themselves spread as people, they get spiritual refreshment, they enjoy the natural beauty, they can enjoy social experiences in a relaxed environment, they can unwind. That's what people come back to as the main determinant of what they're looking for from the countryside. So there is at the core of this an affection for the countryside itself, what it stands for and what it gives us, just because of the way it is. However, there are other things that we have to bear in mind. In providing for the health and well-being of the nation, the countryside does not just have to accommodate those seeking quiet contemplative activity. It's also the place that provides space and safe scope for a number of challenging and adventurous pastimes. Many recreational pursuits people now want to undertake include hang gliding, paragliding, cross-country cycling, motoring, both on 2 and 4 wheels, orienteering, gill scrambling, golf, sailing, canoeing, rock climbing, horse riding and wargaming. Now, a lot of those activities have come onto the scene pretty recently, and so in common with a lot of the characterisation of leisure generally in our society, we see in the countryside a lot of change at the fringes and new activities that people want to undertake. And the numbers who want to take part in them are gradually going up. Now, I don't want to overemphasise this. The vast majority of trips to the countryside, as I'll refer to later, are for the classical being there, relaxing in it, just enjoying it for what it is. But at the fringe, the 10 or so % of trips that are for a specific purpose, which is characterised as some sort of more active and vibrant recreational activity, that is gradually going up. And that element of the activity is also characterised by increasingly high-tech equipment being involved in some of these new activities, and some of them are becoming increasingly space-hungry. So golf's a good example of that. So these aspects of those types of activities add to the degree to which they're perceived to exert pressure, although they don't, except marginally, actually generate an increased number of overall visitors to the countryside. What we are finding is techniques for accommodating them are developing, and there is increasing provision for them. And the other bit of the trend that we need to refer to is that there are new leisure phenomena in much more grand and sort of heavy impact ways, such as the new concept of holiday villages, such as those promoted by Centre Parks and the Rank organisation. This type of new leisure development is forcing a change in the assumptions by which leisure developments are judged. New building materials and techniques, sophisticated landscaping skills and the use of various types of new technology make traditional judgments on what can acceptably be accommodated in the countryside much more a matter for debate than it used to be. Criticism of new developments is nevertheless often based on subjective perceptions about what should and should not happen in the countryside. What is often left out of the argument in these cases is the value of these pastimes as outlets for people's energy and adventure, which, if pent up, could be expressed in more socially disruptive ways. So that sets out a sort of characterization of the sort of use and the volume of use that people are seeking from the countryside. The core of it is as classically presented in photographs and the traditional image, but on the fringes there are these pressures which give greater need to accommodate new activities, some of which are much more technologically based. Let's look further now into the actual people who are undertaking these activities. And the first thing I want to bear in mind is that it's very easy to sort of chop up this group of people and say they're the recreationists and they're the conservationists. And the first thing that we've got to recognise is that the group of people who enjoy the countryside is very much a very heavy overlap with a group of people who are actively involved in conserving the countryside. So the 1.2 million, no, more than that, no, it's 2 million members of the National Trust now, isn't it? I mean, they are people, the attraction of joining the National Trust is to be able to use its properties at a lower cost than you can as a member of the public. So there is embodied in that whole mechanism an assumption that the people who are using the countryside are going to put their hands in their pockets to support an organisation which makes that use high quality and pleasurable and something that can be enjoyed for the future. So this circularity of people who use the countryside for enjoyment, being the same people who are then turn their hand to looking after it, is something that we must bear in mind. So, for instance, the British Trust for Conservation Volunteers will tell you that a large number of people who go out and do voluntary conservation work in the countryside see that as a recreational experience. And in pursuit of that, it trains 30,000 regular. It trains and supports more than 30,000 regular volunteers, and they can turn in something like 120,000 work days a year just from that organisation alone. In 1993, the Ramblers Association surveyed its 105,000 members, and 15% of them stated that they carry out voluntary conservation work, including footpath repairs, and more than 60% of the members of the Ramblers Association are also members of some other organisation which is much more focused on the conservation of the countryside. Two-thirds of the British population visit the countryside at least once a year. That's a pretty... So well over half of our population are habitual, they are regularly expressing their support for the countryside by going there. 40% of the population are going at least once a fortnight. So it's central to the way of life for a lot of our population. This results in 1.25 billion visits to the countryside a year. This is a figure which has held up remarkably steadfastly for over 10 years. It's the most recent survey in 1998 showed a slight drop, but it's not within the bounds of statistical significance. So we have to assume that the figure is about static. The characteristics of those trips are, as you see, often close to home. So half of the visits are no more than 5 miles in a round trip, and a smaller proportion is within a mile of home. 53% of visits are made by car, but if we look at tourists, just the people on holiday going to the countryside, then 85% of them are going by car for their trip to the countryside. 42%, however, are going on foot or by bike. The proportion on bike is tiny, actually. Most of them are people walking from home straight out into the countryside. One of the tricks that we have to cope with in managing this activity is that 40% of these visits take place at the weekend, so it's not spatially, it's not easily spaced out. There's a concentration in time when people have their free time at the weekends. And some rather nifty statistical work says that there could be about 9 million visits on an average weekend. That's an average weekend. A busy weekend sees much more than that. The top 10 most popular activities are walking, hill climbing, and rambling, way ahead of the others, eating and drinking out, taking part in outdoor sports. That's the sort of 10% thing that I was referring to earlier, and 13% visiting friends and relatives. Those figures, maybe this is a place to say that a lot of this data that I'm giving you is material that we gathered in order to give evidence to another inquiry that the House of Commons Environment Committee carried out in 1995, the same committee that looked at urban and country parks last year, looked in 1995 at an inquiry on the impact of leisure on the environment. And a lot of this material is the evidence that we presented to that committee, and their report reflected that they were fairly heavily influenced by this type of material. They came out concluding that leisure in the countryside was not a major factor for its destruction or damage. So a lot of the material I'm giving you, I'm afraid, is figures that we gathered for that 1995 exercise, but where I have been able to, I've updated the figures with more recent surveys. So the top 4 of those activities, I'm able to give you those percentages based on the latest figures, and then from the earlier figures of an earlier United Kingdom Day Visits survey, and I've got no reason to believe these figures have changed. We got 6% going to a leisure attraction, place of interest, 5% just driving around the place, 4% pursuing a hobby or pastime, and then going on down to the very small figures at the bottom. So that is the countryside day visits. There is another group who are tourists away from home for a night or more. 76 million holiday nights in the countryside, and we're counting those as being holiday visits where some experience of the countryside, even if it was of a village environment, but some experience of the countryside was a deliberate factor which people were seeking in their visit. Nearly half of the 17 million overseas visitors to Britain in 1989 walked in the countryside. Overseas visitor numbers are rising, and that's still a trend going on at the moment, whereas the number of domestic holiday makers in England is falling. And we are experiencing that overall visitor numbers are rising, but the countryside share of that is falling. That's resulting in the static line of the group going, of the numbers actually visiting the countryside that I referred to earlier. Very important figure, I think, is that 2/3 of overseas visitors, when surveyed, say they come to Britain. Over 2/3 say they come to Britain because the countryside attracts them. They want to come and experience it. And then you've got a figure there for the length of stay. Right, let's now get something of a line on what level of resources there to accommodate these very large numbers. Well, the Countryside Commission did an estimation that about 1.9 million acres of England, or 6% of the land of the land in the countryside, 6.6% of the countryside land surface, is available for recreation by way of legal right, or some other clear mechanism, for instance, like local authority-owned country parks, common land with access rights, forestry commission land, national trust land, or water company and national park authority land open to access. So that is a figure for the land to which the public have an assured right of access enshrined in law or enshrined in something akin to law. There is a much bigger area which is available for access because people go and are not stopped, and that characterises a lot of the land that is being targeted by the new Countryside and Rights of Way Bill, which is seeking to regularise to a large extent an activity that's going on at the moment and make it much clearer where the various parties stand in that question of people being at large on land where they don't have a legal right to be at the moment. So there's a large area of land, that sort of figure of land, which is available to accommodate these large numbers of visitors. The United Kingdom Day Visit Survey also asked people about their spending behaviour when they visit the countryside. For every one of those trips, those 1.2 billion trips, there is a spend of £6.7, which amounts to an £8.4 billion overall figure for spending in the countryside resulting from people visiting it. You break that down, it's about £2 billion spent by holidaymakers, 700 million by holidaymakers who have come into Britain from overseas. The tourists obviously spend a good deal more per day in the countryside than the day trippers because they're buying much more expensive services, and the figures are rising. Currently they're at £15.30. Also the £6.70 figure is a figure which is rising quite dramatically. Now these sort of spending figures, we through some fairly regularly repeated research, which we're pretty convinced is giving us reliable answers, is generating 340,000 jobs related to people going to the countryside for enjoyment. It's also pretty clear just in the margins of this that those areas of countryside which are popular in this way, which are of high natural beauty, do command much higher capital values in terms of the property when it comes on the market in them. So there's an economic benefit both in terms of the spending and in terms of the capital values of the land concerned in many cases. Many farmers benefit from the presence of visitors through tourism enterprises on the farm, such as accommodation, activity holidays and farm attractions. So a survey carried out in the west of England showed that 23% of farmers in the west of England, 35% in Cornwall were engaged in getting some sort of economic benefit from tourists in this way. That goes down a bit to 23% for the whole of the west of England, and the national average is 15%. Let's have a look at the environmental consequences of this activity going on this sort of area of land. It's easy but misleading to use evidence from a comparatively small number of celebrated and often quoted localities or areas to draw conclusions that overstate problems associated with recreational use of the countryside. When you study the literature which says that recreational use of the countryside is a big problem requiring a sweeping national solution, the anecdotes that are used to back that up tend to be the same places. We hear a lot about the Lake District, various parts of the Pennine Way, and if you go out and look for evidence that those particular hotspots where there are problems are extrapolated throughout the countryside, you don't find it. So it's a feature of this argument, I think, that people are talking about the same places over and over again when they're trying to represent the picture as being one of a serious mismatch between demand and capacity. In fact, what the House of Commons Environment Committee concluded was, I think, in common with what our view of the world is that the recreational damage that does take place in the countryside is dwarfed by damage going on in the countryside through other forces, such as industrialisation, continued trends in farming activity, development and urbanisation, infrastructure generation, such as road building, and other forms of economic exploitation, including the activities of the energy industries. And we spent a lot of the earlier parts of the day talking about some of those other forces acting on the countryside, but just look at the results of recreational activity and try and get them into proportion. We have carried out 2 surveys of this condition of the rights-of-way system in England. The most recent one in 1993-94, we're just about to do another one. It came up with a figure in the end based on a very large sample that less than 1% of the rights-of-way network is actually eroded to such an extent that it can be said to be in poor condition. And that means eroded so you can visibly see it eroded. And we actually classified that as saying a bare patch of land more than 2 meters wide being the erosion. If you look at erosion to the extent that the rights-of-way are becoming difficult to use, the figure is a good deal lower than 1%. And we also have to bear in mind that by no means all of that erosion is caused by users walking or riding along the rights-of-way. Other causes include congregation of livestock in some of the overgrazed areas used by agricultural vehicles. 2.8% of the 11 designated national trails, we've got 11 national trails in England, are badly eroded and awaiting repair. And most of that is concentrated on the Cleveland Way and the Pennine Way. In fact, that figure has gone down since these figures because we have been carrying out a pretty big campaign of repairs on the Pennine Way. The Pennine Way, at the time that these surveys were carried out, in the most recent survey in 1994, had about 15% of its 502 kilometres damaged in this way. So that needs to be borne in mind when we hear that the Pennine Way is, sort of sinking under the use of visitors. 15% of it is actually damaged, and we're doing something about it. The rest of it is okay. Traffic on the rural road network is growing faster than elsewhere, so that the growth in traffic is faster in rural areas than elsewhere in the countryside. But that is due mainly to factors other than leisure use of the countryside. It's due to the need to have a car if you live in a rural area because of non-existent or very poor public transport provision. It's based on the wish of people to commute, and it's based on a number of other influences. The actual volume of traffic use generated by leisure use is probably somewhere between 7 and 12% of rural traffic is related to visits to the countryside. Sorry again that these figures are rather old. I haven't had a chance to update them. But in the mid-1990s, one year when English Nature reported the instances of damage to SSSIs, it quoted 117 instances of damage. That was on 3,500 sites of special scientific interest, and 18 of those 117 were due to recreational use. And in only 4 of those instances did the English Nature believe that the damage that had been caused was going to last long term. And most of the use in those cases was related to vehicular, off-road vehicular use. We have, a number of bodies have tried time and time again to carry out reliable studies on the impact of walkers on ground nesting moorland birds. And the studies, as far as they've been able to reach any common view, have noted localized disturbance and redistribution effects, but haven't noted any significant impacts on overall breeding populations. And it's hard to draw any conclusions that damage of walkers on ground nesting birds actually has a long-lasting effect on the birds. They tend to move elsewhere. And in one natural study in the Peak District, the presence of walkers actually improved the lot. The population of ground nesting birds in that site that was studied went up slightly. The belief was that it had gone up because the walkers were deterring the predators that would otherwise have been nicking the ground nesting birds, damaging their nests and taking their eggs. Litter in the countryside is the last thing I want to talk about in this section. It really isn't very well studied. It's often talked about, but I think generally the conclusion is that it's a problem which has got better and better. And the Tidy Britain group studied litter with some money given to it by the Countryside Commission in 1991, found that many areas in the countryside are virtually litter-free, and problems tended to be concentrated on sites with high visitor numbers. But generally speaking, it's been hard to deduce the volume of the problem generated by visitors to the countryside, because it's hard to actually separate litter that visitors have left from litter that's just around the place for the local inhabitants anyway. There are other factors at large in relation to people visiting the countryside. And the next thing I want to talk about is relations between visitors and other countryside users. In the 1980s, the Countryside Commission and the Sports Council carried out a major study on access. Found that 94% of farmers reported some recreational activity on their land. So that's, most farmers have actually got people visiting their land in some way. 82% of farmers had land crossed by a public right-of-way, so presumably that's how a lot of people were getting there. The general conclusions of the study were that visitors were found to be an irritant rather than an impediment to farming from that study. 60% of the sample of farmers reported damage to field boundaries, 53% reported gates left open, 49% reported rubbish dumping, and 42% quoted trespass, which was people leaving the land where they actually had a legal right to be. The percentage of farms where public access-related factors constituted an actual impediment to the day-to-day running was much lower. So 15% said trespass was actually interfering with their farming. 8% mentioned pressure from nearby development interfering with their farming, and that is a significant one for that 8%. It's a significant problem. 6.2% mentioned damage to field boundaries, actually getting in the way of their farming operations, and 4% mentioned litter to an extent that it was damaging their farming operations. So the general picture there is that farmers are finding access irritating, but the number who can actually cite examples of where it's damaging their farming operation is lower. Farmers are certainly antipathetic to further public access. The same study found that 42% were opposed to public access to their farms, 32% were not opposed to it but were worried by it, and 24%, so it's about a quarter of the sample, were broadly favourable to admitting public access onto the land, but only in return for payment. Just about the whole sample were opposed to extending permanent public access as of right. These figures came from a countryside stewardship survey carried out in 1993. Interesting to note, however, that 85% of farms and estates used for game shooting have public rights-of-way passing over them, and the public rights-of-way tend to be well used, and 20% of the estates and farms used for shooting have some wider access on them. Only 17% of shooting occupiers said that public access had any effect on shooting or associated management. Dogs is the last thing I want to mention because it's just about impossible to come to any conclusions about the extent of the dog problem. Dogs are frightening, especially to livestock farmers. They worry about them a lot, and it's a significant problem because of that, because you don't need many dog incidents, and you don't need to be involved in a dog incident and have one of your animals left in the pretty unpleasant state that dogs can leave livestock in, to be very severely put off the prospect of having strangers' dogs around the place. But it's very difficult to get a line on just how bad that problem is, because it's very difficult to separate visitors' dogs again from the dogs that reside in the local area. I want to finish up by talking about the measures that exist to cope with the problems as far as they exist. We have a planning system, which we've already referred to in this country, which takes on board a lot of the more heavily impacting leisure use of the countryside. So, excluded from it is clay pigeon shooting, war games and motorcycle scrambling, which you can do for 28 days but no more before you have to go and get planning permission. Some of the more heavy impact leisure activities can cause local problems when they're not managed or located properly. But generally speaking, the planning system is able to sort out these problems and get damaging or antisocial use of the countryside brought under control. The next mechanism is a technique of countryside management services, a technique pioneered by the Countryside Commission of really putting a man and a checkbook in some sort of vehicle and just saying, sort out the problems that accrue to the countryside in this area, and giving them as open a brief as that. And we've used that approach in over 200 countryside management projects, concentrating on heritage coasts, urban fringe areas, community forests and areas of outstanding natural beauty. And the Countryside Commission funded a lot of them and was very keen to see this approach adopted. We studied our investment in countryside management projects in 1990 in a value for money study. And we found just in that 1 year that the 100 projects that we included in the sample were able to deliver us evidence of having led to the planting of 950,000 trees, the completion of 65,300 conservation work days, the management of 2,700 hectares of recreation sites and 4,000 kilometres of rights of way, the conducting of 3,800 guided walks or other outdoor events, and 4,400 talks or indoor events organised. And that's a sort of fairly crude figures, but there are these mechanisms available which can have fairly profound and significant impact on the way the countryside is managed in individual localities. Management of public rights of way is an important way of managing public access and public use of the countryside. We have had to regroup and rethink how we are going to get the 200,000 kilometres of public rights of way in England up to the standard that they need to be to cope effectively with and efficiently with today's leisure demands. They have certainly improved since we started this campaign in 1987. But I think we're now sort of three quarters of the way to the target, a target we were hoping to meet this year. The local authorities, the local highway authorities, have been the main agents of meeting that target, and it's mainly funding difficulties, but I think also lack of political will, which has resulted in that target not being met. Now, I don't think there's a great will on the part of anyone to walk away from it at this stage. I think we have to regroup and think about how we're going to actually finish the job. The encouraging news is that most of the problems reside on the legal definition and the information provision about rights of way. The actual physical state, the physical condition of most of the network is much more than 75% up to standard now. So we've certainly made progress with that. We've also been very comfortable with the idea of coping with leisure use of the countryside by just increasing the choices and increasing the range of places for people to go. So the Countryside Commission, since it was set up in 1969, helped local authorities and others to provide about 500 country parks and picnic sites. And these can accommodate large numbers of visitors, especially the ones close to towns. The Sandwell Valley, just south of Birmingham, takes in about 1.25 million visits a year. The Rother Valley Country Park in Yorkshire takes about 750,000 visits a year. So here are significant numbers of people going to the countryside, going to these places specifically managed for them. In addition, we have the Countryside Commission and now the Countryside Agency supporting 12 community forests, which have the accommodation of recreation as a major part of their job. We set up the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, which is now handled by the Ministry of Agriculture, which has a large element of provision of voluntary provision or at least the making available of land for public access, and when we handed it over to the Ministry of Agriculture, there were about 900 agreements already in place for public access, and that's gone up. And we've tended to try and get those placed close to where people live. In addition, the Countryside Commission, which has had grant aid money to disperse, has helped the National Trust, Woodland Trust and County Wildlife Trusts acquire land so they can manage it for recreation. Some of the places that Peter saw you pictures of were acquired with Countryside Commission money. We didn't pay the whole whack, but we certainly made a contribution. We have good techniques, I think, for promoting good practice on sporting use of the countryside. Most sporting activity in the countryside is governed by the governing bodies of sport, of which there are some 50 or 60, and most of those, where appropriate, have been quite willing and are keen to promote to their members codes of practice for the way their sport is carried out in the countryside, so that it doesn't result in antisocial or damaging effects to the environment. The tourism bodies have a significant role to play. The first time they made an inroad into it really was in the Task Force on Tourism and Environment, set up by the Department of Employment in 1990, which made enormous strides. It set out the parameters for how to make tourism work in the countryside in the most advantageous way to all concerned. And that, it all went rather quiet for a long time, but it's very gratifying to see the tourism policy produced last year by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and now the tourism policies being drawn up by the new English Tourism Council are very strongly focused, as far as rural tourism is concerned, on the need to safeguard and enhance and husband the countryside, because they have at last cottoned on that the quality of our countryside environment, the quality of our historic built environment is the lifeblood of our tourism industry. I don't see people coming in here for sun or necessarily the nightlife. It's the beauty of the place that is feeding our tourism industry. The Countryside Commission, the Countryside Agency and the English Tourism Council, in fact, at this moment, has out for consultation, well, in fact, consultation closed on the 31st of March, a draft policy on rural tourism, which tries to draw together all the points about how to make tourism work in the countryside to the benefit of all. We haven't found tourism operators, regional tourism boards, tourism consortia at all resistant to the idea of bringing the concept of greening tourism into the centre of their operations. They're keen to do the right thing because I think they've cottoned on as well that it's part of their lifeblood. Information, education and interpretation were mentioned this morning as important aspects of the way to help the countryside accommodate people by educating and making the people feel more on board in terms of their intellect as well as their physical presence, to introduce them to what the countryside is all about through some of these techniques. It's an area which the Countryside Commission promoted very strongly in the 1970s, and then it rather got neglected. There's certainly an incipient debate. It hasn't really got going yet as to whether we should get back into that field now, and it'll be an interesting debate to see whether we are prepared to start launching a new initiative, the Community of Interest on the Countryside, to improve the quality of environmental interpretation for visitors to the countryside. There is certainly room for improvement. The classic way, of course, of making people aware of the potential impact of their presence in the countryside is through the Country Code, which was published by the National Parks Commission in 1953. But there again, we've surveyed people's awareness of it, and those of us who occasionally pick up quizzes on radio programs, I'm always impressed on really quite erudite quiz teams being asked to name a national park, often can't, or get somewhere which isn't, and can't actually name a national park. So awareness of some of our designated areas is way below awareness of the Country Code. Our surveys have in fact shown that 75% of all visitors to the countryside can actually quote accurately at least one of the little memory points in the Country Code. So their awareness of it is good. We also, through the Wildlife and Countryside Act in 1981, were charged with informing people of their rights for the countryside. And so this body of publications that we put out on the Country Code and the Access Charter, which is what we called that Statement of People's Rights, has far and away been the main seller. It's outstripped all other titles in the Countryside Commission's publication lists. And the distribution figures were that we've got rid of 3 million copies of this stuff in 10 years. So in a decade we tend to produce that amount of material. So there's plenty of audience out there for it. I want to mention, before I close, the precautionary principle. I think all those involved in managing the countryside accept that there needs to be a precautionary principle to public access as well as to everything else. However, the precautionary principle means different things to different people. And so I would commend to you the definition which says that public access the public access should not be proved guilty and it should not be assumed guilty until it's been proved guilty. Some people, for instance, would say the precautionary principle says that unless there's clear evidence that the presence of people has no significant impact on wildlife, which is extremely difficult to prove anyway, public access should be excluded or carefully managed. You will find places in the debate about the provisions for access that occur at the moment a fair degree of sort of knee-jerk reaction at SSSIs, for instance, and public access. The fact that someone's an SSSI automatically means that you can't have public access. And it's never been the view of English nature that that's the case. It's never been our view that that's the case. And I think the figures help prove that the sort of use of the countryside that we're talking about and the other things that we value the countryside for do and can coexist. However, that doesn't mean that we just sort of turn our back and walk away with our hands in our pockets. We need to be aware of the importance of nature conservation, especially in those sites which have been designated as particularly ecologically important. And when appropriate, we do have to be sure that recreation is planned and managed carefully in regard to nature conservation. And a very important part of that is where we think there might be problems, we monitor the situation closely. and that we adjust our management prescriptions swiftly if the monitoring shows that to be the case. But at the back of all this, let's remember that the countryside, which is traditionally used by people, common land and similar places, is also the countryside which has for a long time been valued for its high nature conservation value. Now, there are certain ecological types of place, like wetlands and some of our more fragile coastlands, where the pressure of feet has a damaging effect pretty quickly. But there's also large areas of population where the ecological qualities that we're talking about can be coexisting with the sort of public access that we view as traditional. We have, I think, most importantly, to concentrate on not the people in the countryside, but the flipping cars they bring with them. That is the most intractable bit of the problem. But it's very difficult to isolate visitor traffic generated by people wanting to visit the countryside, from the general enormous problem which we're finding so difficult to solve of people in general being wedded to or forced to be wedded to their reliance on their private car. And we really do have a major mountain to climb, I'm quite sure, in tackling the expectations that I think we have to adjust, that people have come used to in expecting to have very high levels of personal mobility through their private car. It is quite clear that the costs of that on the environment are unacceptable. And the visitor generation of traffic has to take its share of solving the problem along with everything else. So we're trying out some ways of doing it. We've been trying out ways of getting better public transport services in popular tourist areas, helping out with the provision of cycle hire schemes, etc. The nature of the problem is not just about congestion and sitting in traffic jams and getting fed up and the kids getting squirmy in the back of the car. The level of traffic can get to such a level that it actually damages the character of the countryside in which this traffic is congregating. The large volumes of traffic on small lanes can actually tear up the verges, cause highway authorities to come along and lop trees when they wouldn't otherwise need to, cause bends to be evened out. They can actually take away from the countryside character. And of course, there are still extensive areas of open grazing in our countryside where the countryside character depends on that open grazing continuing. And the presence of large numbers of vehicles and cattle and sheep allowed to wander all over the place is not a very happy one. Again, increasingly farmers who are up against it in so many other ways are finding it increasingly unacceptable to put their cattle out on open grazed areas where the risk of their cattle or sheep being killed by motor vehicles is unacceptably high. There's a big worry area there. Peace and quiet is affected by traffic noise, and then the things which highway authorities come along to do to accommodate the greater volumes of traffic, the upgrading of the road furniture and the curbing, etc., again can damage the countryside itself. And then on a broader scale, the general volume of traffic that we have to accommodate in this island at the moment, the pollution, the environmental damage to the landscape, the knock-on effect of that on wildlife and local countryside character are all things that we have to attend to in taming our reliance on the private car. Congestion itself is still relatively rare in the countryside and confined to the times when, if you're wise, you don't go, sort of Sundays, school holidays and bank holidays. The traffic jams are much more common in towns still than the countryside. And so, because these problems are localised, they can often be solved by localised traffic schemes, but nevertheless these are expensive to put into place. But we are piloting schemes in the Lake District in Cumbria, in Surrey, in the North York Moors and Dartmoor. I think the findings of all those schemes are that they're difficult to do, but you can make them work, but they cost money. Another way in which we're trying to get much better provision is to encourage those who do provide public transport to provide it at times and places and costs so that people in the countryside, people on visits to the countryside are more ready and willing to use them. And I can talk from considerable experience that I believe we are missing a trick in selling public transport as part. Someone said public transport should be fun. Going on holiday and driving around everywhere is not fun for a lot of people. And we seem to be missing a trick, I think, in saying part of the holiday experience is that you can drive there if you must, but once you've got to your destination, lock the car up and use public transport because it's so much more, your holiday is so much more valuable to you if you do so. We haven't really touched on that area yet. They're doing it a bit in the North York Moors, and the experience is a very good one. To sum up, I think I would draw attention to some of these places which are often quoted. Dovedale is one of the places, a valley in the south of the Peak District, which was a hellhole at one time. The Peak District National Park moved in and attended to the erosion and the severe overcrowding by fairly simple techniques of resiting and redesigning car parks, reducing them in size, re-engineering footpaths, and taking sort of fairly common sense solutions so that Dovedale is now not suffering a sort of environmental damage and proving to be the sort of careworn place that it used to be to visit. The Upper Derwent Valley, also in the Peak District National Park, underwent similar remedial treatment and similarly has been generally considered a success story. I've already mentioned the Pennine Way, where there was damage to a proportion of its length, damage that was considered unacceptable, and fairly recently worked out engineering solutions are now being put in place at considerable cost, but they're being put in place and the situation is being brought in hand. Land's End, close to where I come from, where all my childhood it was a place that you avoided, A, because it was pricey, and a bit of, no, I better not say that, it was pricey, and, you know, pretty badly eroded and not much there to enjoy, so you tended to go to other places. A management moved in and bought the site and showed the necessary determination to sort the place out. And if you go there now, it might not be the experience that everyone wants, but it is not the environmental disaster that it used to be. Tor Torridge Estuary, very heavily used area of North Devon, used by a large number of water enthusiasts, where the production of a joint management plan, which got everyone signed up to it, has made the problem of shared use much more one that is now generally considered acceptable. Quantock Hills, also in the west of England, where conflicts between recreational and local land use interests have been addressed through a locally agreed management plan. The importance there of getting local people to sign up to the solutions that people want to take on board. And finally, Box Hill in Surrey, owned by the National Trust. Again, one of these sites which has often been quoted as a place where, you know, if you want to see recreational damage to the countryside at its best, go and have a look at Box Hill. Not now, because you know, the necessary measures have been put in place, so that it is now back to much more acceptable standards. What do we need to do then if we're going to take a sensible approach, and an approach which isn't based on hyperbole, to the impact that undoubtedly accrues both beneficial and potential environmental damage to people visiting the countryside? Well, what we need to do is to look at the situation carefully, take a cold and calculating look, and where there is a problem, first of all, admit it. And that isn't always easy, but if there's a problem, we should admit it. And often it'll be taking place in a location where there are a lot of different organisations jointly involved in its management. So the first thing to do is to nominate one of those to take the lead in setting up a partnership to make the problem solvable. Then survey it comprehensively and prepare a prescriptive management plan. Apply for the special funding that you're going to need to carry out. And there's an overall message that we gave to the House of Commons Environment Committee in 1995, is that this is not a problem so long as the public purse is prepared to find the small amount of money required to solve it. It's not a problem which solves itself. There are simple and straightforward techniques that we've learnt over the years, but they do cost a bit of money. And so if the Treasury sits on its hands all the time, we will continue to have a problem, and it's bad housekeeping because the problem will become more and more expensive to solve. So you apply for special funding to solve your local problem and put in the necessary works, and then you implement it, and then you monitor it, and if necessary you go around the circle again until you've got it right. Thank you very much.
We will be prepared to answer questions if there are any. Good. Very well, everybody.
Thank you. Could I ask you about the geographical spread of those farmers who were interviewed about nuisance? Because if it was throughout the country, then might you have been underestimating the amount of nuisance that farmers on the rural fringe suffer from, which are not in honeypots, but are due to people simply walking their dog close to their home and perhaps not respecting the needs of the farmer as somebody trying to make a living?
It was a... I'll stand up and shout. It was a number of sample areas. Nottingham, there was an urban fringe area involved. Let me just dig out the evidence, because I quoted it in the evidence. The study tracks were in North Wales, part of the Peak National Park, which included a bit of the Pennines, the East Midlands, south of Nottingham, and the Dorset coast. And so the urban fringe area was the Nottingham one. So there was no, we didn't survey the whole country, but we had study tracks, and it did include the urban fringe areas. And I don't think that message that you've said is lost. I think because of the work we've done specifically with countryside management projects, why we sought to target urban fringe areas is because there's a lot of standing off developing, and them and us, because farmers in some urban fringe areas were starting to feel embattled. And it's very easy to get to that state because the problems are worse there. The really encouraging thing is where you actually put in hand a simple mechanism to find solutions, the problem doesn't go away, but it becomes livable with again.
Where do you have information centres? How many are about?
The Countryside Agency doesn't have any information centres. National parks that we sort of sponsor through the duties that we've inherited from the National Parks Commission, there are about 47 National Park information centres in England and Wales. And the Countryside Commission in its day, funded something like 180, I think, countryside information and interpretation centres. But there's more than those that we funded. There aren't huge numbers of them. You consider the whole of England. I think the 180 is a figure for England. But even for that land area, that number of information centres is not huge. It doesn't include National Trust funds.
Terry, you referred to the extent to which the appearance of the landscape is important for tourism and the amount of money that generates, and that's certainly borne out by the Trust's own experience with regard to studies that we've done. Huge amounts of money are generated by tourism, both UK tourism and visitors from abroad. The issue perhaps is where that money goes. Quite a lot of it doesn't tend to go to the people who are producing the countryside that people come to enjoy, in other words, to farmers. So an issue that we all perhaps need to address is what mechanism can we use to transfer some of that cash into the pockets of the people who are the producer of what I was talking about this composite product, all the different things we want from the countryside. I wonder, do you have any views on any novel ways or not so novel ways of achieving that price transfer, such as a tourism tax or anything like that?
We've been involved in the discussions as far as they've taken place about a tourism tax. I don't think anyone is that impressed at the prospect of a tourism tax, because immediately you come up against the whole argument with the Treasury about hypothecation, and the suspicion is that even if the money accrued to the conservation of the built heritage in the countryside in the first place, some bright spark in the Treasury would find a way of filching it away at some stage. That's been history. So I don't think a tourism tax. It's not the flavour of the month, certainly. We have experimented with voluntary contribution schemes, tourism trusts, and I think we're going to do some more of that. The English Tourism Council is keen to experiment some more with that. The evidence of that is that the tourists, if asked when they're paying for their meal in the pub, which is the way some of these things work, for instance, they go to a tourism operator, they buy a service, and they get a bill which says 18 quid for your meal, and a line at the bottom which says voluntary contribution to upkeep of the area £1. That's one of the ways of doing it. The surveys that have been done on that have shown that the tourists are both quite unfazed by that request. They don't mind being asked, and a lot of them actually want to pay and will pay more than what they're asked. There is great resistance, which I think we need to work out from tourism operators who think it's going to turn off business. And so there is work to be done. Another area which I haven't had time to talk about is a huge area of work we're just starting to get involved in. Someone mentioned you are what you eat. We are going to be launching a campaign in which the Prime Minister has been very interested, called Eat the View. which is all about local products and exactly the message that you said, that the quality of what you're producing from the land is bound to be reflected in the way the land looks. And if we can get some link made in consumers' minds between high quality food that they can trust and a landscape that they can love, then we should do so. And so we are going to be helping out. We're already helping out with local farmers markets. We're helping out with local food cooperatives. You mentioned a National Trust brand. We sponsor 37 areas of outstanding natural beauty in England. Some of those are already talking about a Weald brand or a Surrey Hills brand, where at the moment there's a fair amount of discussion amongst people in the area as to whether they like to be living in the AONB or outside the AONB. We want to make the AONB cachet so strong that people want to be in. They want to be able to sell their produce because it's got that sort of quality mark on it. Long way to go, but they're all interesting ideas.
What is your policy? If nobody can hear me, I'll shout mine. Thank you. What is your policy about the use of four-wheel drive vehicles, motorcycles, and other noise-producing activities in the countryside, particularly, for instance, I know the Downs, South Downs, which is shortly, if it's not already, a new national park, but I've been to other national park areas, and these sort of things are completely antithetical, I suppose is the right term, I don't know, to the quiet enjoyment of these areas by walkers and those seeking to relieve tension, which was one of the points I think that you made earlier. And one of the problems is, even if you have rules, who is actually going to police them?
Well, to some minds, taking any sort of motor vehicle off the tarmac road is pretty distasteful. Nevertheless, for a portion of our rights of way network, it's legal. And I think our policy is that where it's legal, it's a legitimate public interest in the countryside that we have to see managed as effectively as possible. And so we, again, advise, for instance, a couple of our national trails have got vehicular access. One of them is the Ridgeway, where we have sought to solve some of the impacts of vehicular use on that. There again, you do the sums and you find out the proportion of the network used by motor vehicles which is actually suffering damage. And of course, it isn't just noise; it's actual damage to the fabric of the lane, damage to the surface, making it difficult to walk or ride on by the people. Now, there are areas where there is damage, but they form a small proportion again of the whole network. And so, I think our policy is that it isn't something which I don't think we have a policy. I mean, the government might. It's interesting that this bit that we were expecting to see in the Countryside and Rights of Way Bill dealing with motorised use of off-road tracks, I don't think has actually got into the bill yet. So no one's finding it easy to solve. It wouldn't be our policy to make it illegal. In the lead-up to the introduction of that bill, there might have been some cause for suspecting the government might be about to try and legislate against it. Until that happens, I think it's a legitimate use which has to be managed. And in some cases, in a very few cases, that management might involve traffic regulation orders. But generally, I think a lot of the use is amenable to the sort of management techniques that I've mentioned.
Yes, Peter.
I was struck by the similarity and the figures that you were mentioning between the percentage of the population that make countryside visits and those that take part in active pursuits. There's an extremely close correlation with those who use urban open spaces, almost exactly the same kind of figures.
think it does, yes. I think there are two important strands to that argument. One is the one I referred to, that if we have a public policy and public expenditure to keep the countryside in the sort of state that we can feel that we want to cherish it, and that doesn't mean freezing in an aspic, it's a dynamic living countryside, but still we want a countryside of quality. If we want that, then it must embody an assumption that benefit accrues to the whole population, and we all have equal opportunity to enjoy it. And a lot of that involves being in it and getting that enjoyment from it. But I think there is also a fair amount of local evidence that areas that are fairly well peopled do suffer. Well, in some cases, the environment, the field wall, climbing over walls, and there are some pressurised bits of national parks which are very popular, where having a large number of people does cost you extra money because they're there. But in terms of antisocial behaviour, I think there is a fair degree of evidence that having a large number of reasonably minded people around the place keeps less reasonably minded people away.
Final question. You finished off your talk talking about the car. You had quite a tirade against the car, and you seem pretty convinced that it's the wrong way to go. And I think most of us are. But you started your talk stating that you drove in the morning into Cheltenham. Sort of that dilemma. You're very convinced that it is wrong. How can we if even people like you still drive their cars? Where do we go?
Put back the bus that was running for a year and then they took it off. Or actually make a bus available. There's a 4-mile bit of my journey which I can't do and get to work at a reasonable time. And if they put on a bus, it's the Cotswolds, and Leckhampton Hill is well named. I mean, interestingly enough, the pressure on us to abandon our cars for work is now very strong. Our main headquarters building is being refurbished. It's a historic listed building, and we got to spend the money on it anyway. Part of that refurbishment, and it was not a popular decision, involved removing all but 6 spaces from the car park. So those of us who find no alternative to driving a car to Cheltenham are going to have the extra hassle of parking it somewhere else in Cheltenham, and we will gradually be pushed off using our cars. So we're on the road. No, we're on the road. It's the wrong sort of image. We're on the way with that. I suppose the point is that when people who, as far as one can own up to it, we have an influence on public opinion, people in our sort of position, where people like us are forced to suffer the hassle of not having a car park outside our office. We're forced to use public transport, and it's people like us who will then start exerting the economic and political pressure to get the public transport system better.
Thank you very much indeed. If we've all exhausted our questions, we've got arrangements for tomorrow, which Axel will tell you about, and look forward to seeing you again. And thank you very much indeed for coming today.
Right. Yes, you may applaud. Tomorrow we serve coffee in our bar next door at 9 o'clock, and we start with Michael Synnott, who talks about Milton Keynes. Even the best laid plans must move on. Now that will be very interesting. And then it continues during the day. I mean, you all got the program. So we meet tomorrow from 9 o'clock onwards. For those who are still interested in coming to our trip on Sunday, sadly, the trip is sold out. So those who are having a ticket for the Sunday are very lucky, and we meet at 10:30 at the information desk on the left inside County Hall, but I will repeat that tomorrow. So I hope you all enjoyed the day, and see you again tomorrow.